I'm Bryan Painter. Thanks for joining us on News OK Live. We have a Google Plus Hangout today on winter weather. I'm joined today by Gary McManus of the Oklahoma Climatological Survey and Terri Angier of the State Transportation Department. Thanks to each of you for joining me today.
Great to be here.
All right, we're just going to kind of go over some different things from different perspectives that each of them have. You know, Gary, I know you hear this question. A few days ago, we had the earliest autumn freeze in Oklahoma City, the first official autumn freeze. And people would ask, you know, does that mean we're going to have a really cold winter? Well, 7 days later, this last Sunday, we have 98 degrees at Mangum. People ask, does that mean we're going to have a mild winter? What do you answer? How do you answer that type of question as far as, you know, what does this mean to what maybe we're going to get?
Yeah, it's really hard to correlate anything, any singular weather event to a forecast, especially out to a seasonal basis. So when we look at that record earliest freeze for Oklahoma City and we try and, you know, extrapolate that out into the future, as you said, it was extremely warm. We got record highs across the state on Sunday. So there really is no correlation between that. It's just a singular extreme weather event. You know, we can go back to February 10th of 2011 when, you know, a lot of the states saw record cold temperatures, and we set our all-time record coldest temperature ever recorded in the state with minus 31 degrees at Nowata. And then, you know, basically a week later, we had highs in the 70s and 80s. And then we ended up with the warmest summer on record. So, you know, that's the warmest summer for anywhere in the United States history based on a statewide average. So there really is no correlation. What we look for when we're trying to do things like seasonal forecasts would be, you know, large-scale climate factors that are in play, such as El Nino, La Nina, or other big climate factors like that.
Are there any indicators to that regard so far? I know sometimes on your Mesonet ticker, you'll talk about what the Climate Prediction Center is putting out. Any indication that far out or not?
Well, there's a lot of angst right now in the climatological field because the El Nino we thought was going to develop, and it started to develop pretty nicely as we got later into summer. You know, then we start to see that the El Nino is starting to fade, which almost never happens when we get farther into the season. Now, that El Nino would have brought, in general, cooler and wetter conditions across the southern third of the United States and warmer and drier conditions across the northern third of the United States and other differences across the country. But when we start to lose that El Nino, really, you know, all bets are off. We don't have a large-scale climate factor to fall back on to say, well, it might be, you know, cooler and wetter this winter, which certainly would have been welcome considering the last 2 years we've had under extreme drought conditions.
All right, thanks, Gary. Terri, when we do get a winter event, how do you guys kind of prioritize what areas are going to get, you know, treatment first? You know, where you're going to sand, where you're going to salt, where you're going to send the trucks. How do you kind of prioritize that?
Right. You know, unlike the cities that have to pick snow routes, ODOT doesn't have a certain route that we go to first because we have maintenance yards all over the state to deal with different stretches of highways. And we also understand during snow and ice, people really come to the highways expecting it to be more clear. So the only priority we place on clearing the routes is because overpasses and bridges get freeze faster. We start there within that stretch, but we address all highways. Sometimes it gets extremely difficult. For example, if there is a 4-lane highway, we may be able to clear one lane depending on the amount of precipitation on each direction, but we do address every highway that we have, and we have crews spread all over the state to do that.
All right, thanks very much. Gary, I'm looking at questions here from viewers, and I got a really good question. I was going to ask you this later, but I'll go ahead and move it up. You know, we're talking about precipitation and kind of in ways that we might dread as far as ice and all. But a viewer asked, will this help, if we get good precipitation, will it help end our drought? And I know, that's a question on everyone's mind right now, and certainly something you follow. You have a lot of input into the U.S. Drought Monitor report that comes out each week. Kind of talk about winter precipitation and how it affects that overall drought picture.
Yeah, this drought really got started back in the late fall and winter of 2009, or 2010, 2011. So October 2010 is when it started, and then it really intensified as we went through that winter and got into the spring. Winter precipitation is fantastic for recharging soils, especially because there's not a lot of heat going on, so the evaporation is down. There's not a lot of evaporation from our lakes and reservoirs. And humans aren't using as much water during the winter. And also, of course, plants mostly go dormant. So it's a great time to get precipitation. And we saw that last winter when we really put a big dent in that drought from, October, November, all the way through into March. Especially if it comes in the form of snow. I know it's not always a pretty thing when we get snow, but for the agricultural community, it's great because it sets on the ground, it melts very slowly, and it percolates into the soil. It doesn't run off. So winter is always a very important recharge period. The trouble is when we have a drought of this magnitude, and we're going into this winter with, a large part of the state covered by severe to exceptional drought, which is, of course, very bad drought. It's not a wet time of the year, unfortunately. So we really need one of those extreme winter precipitations or precipitation events to put a dent in this drought, because as we get into the colder months of the year, the amount of available water in the air goes down to turn into rainfall or snowfall, whatever form of precipitation. So we did have an extremely wet winter last year, so that's really what we can hope for. Sometimes that comes with snow and ice, but still, it's a necessary evil, just like our precipitation we get in the springtime comes with a lot severe thunderstorms a lot of times. It's just the way we get our precipitation here in Oklahoma.
All right, thanks. If you're just joining us, I'm Bryan Painter here on News OK Live. This is a Google Plus Hangout on winter weather. I have Gary McManus from the Oklahoma Climatological Survey and Terri Angier with the State Transportation Department. And Gary, I'll ask you a question that'll feed right into a question to Terri. But Gary, kind of talk about geographically where Oklahoma sits and what that does with our winters. We have the Rockies on one side, we get that Gulf moisture. What does that mean? I've sat nights, looked at your mesonet site. I'll see the temperatures dropping, I'll see the moisture, coming up, and then where the two meet is usually not a good scenario sometimes. But kind of talk about Oklahoma geographically and how that contributes to variances in the type of weather we get here in the winter.
Right, and that geography is, of course, important for weather all throughout the year, and Oklahoma sits in a sort of a unique place as much as the Great Plains does. We get the cold air coming down, rushing down the lee of the Rockies, something known as cold air damming. We get those storm systems approaching from the west that kicks up southern winds. Those southerly winds bring up moisture from the Gulf, and they meet sometimes right here over Oklahoma. That moisture overrides that cold, shallow layer of cold air, and then of course we get precipitation forming. Now, how thick that layer of cold air is, and also if there are any layers in between the upper level and the lower level of warmer air, that determines what type of precipitation we get. As we've seen over the last decade or so, we often get very severe ice storms. We can get extremely heavy snowfalls. And of course we can just get plain old rain like we saw last winter. It really depends on the temperatures that come along with that precipitation. And since there is so much energy available with the heat that comes up from the south clashing with that cold air from the north, oftentimes that winter precipitation will become convective, which basically when you hear the things about thunder snow or thunder ice, that's when things get really serious and it gets really heavy. And that's when we've seen our really disastrous winter weather over the last 2 or 3 years, when we get that thunder snow, that convective type situation.
All right, thanks. Terri, I'll go right over to you. You know, we're talking about how just a degree here or there can change things. It can change the scenario of where a winter storm sets up, you know, who gets the heaviest total, who gets ice, who gets the snow, or a combination. How tough does that make it for you guys to get out in front of a storm? And also, if you would, kind of give me a idea of what type of resources you do have as far as trucks, graders, things like that.
Sure. One of the key points I want to make is to remind everyone that really one of the misperceptions is that there's a whole lot to do before a storm hits. And we can't clear a roadway that doesn't have snow on it yet, for example. But some of the things we can do, as you mentioned, is preparation. Frankly, our preparations begin in July. We begin to stock up with salt and material starting in July, because as the fall months come, a lot of the states, especially in the northeast part of the country, begin to have the same type of demands on salt and materials. So we try to beat that, and we've done extremely well, especially in the last 5 years, being able to get a lot of that material in place in July and August, which is very early for any state to begin working on, especially any state in this region. But we do a lot of that. Equipment is a big factor in terms of making sure everything is ready to go, the crews, the scheduling and all that. But when a storm hits, there's a few things we can do, but other than that, really we have to have something that's precipitated before we can clear the road. There is a mag chloride solution that we try to use at times on certain bridges and on many areas. And northwest part of the state, as you mentioned, is one of the areas that we have a lot of those automatic dispensers, because that's an area that always gets frozen very quickly and you have to move quick. And mag chloride is an exact science, so you have to know exactly at what point and at what temperatures they are going to be effective, or it can actually cause a hazard if the precipitation doesn't take place when it was supposed to. It could actually cause some slippery hazards. So our engineers are extremely careful in how they use mag chloride, but we do use that. But other than that, it's really, and that keeps the precipitation from bonding to the pavement very quickly. The other resources we use, of course, Gary mentioned a lot of those things that we are glued to their information and to the National Weather Service and to all the local predictions, because we have to rely on a lot of those folks to kind of see what we're going to do first. Highway Patrol is an extremely big partner with us during times like that, and they are extremely good to work with. We rely on them a lot, and we work together. And our engineers, many of them are watching to bring the crews in at the right time. And then it's just dispensing them out into the areas that need to be clearing the roadway on.
You know, Terri, I'll stay with you. You mentioned working with Highway Patrol, and that's part of that visual out there and with your crews. And I know Rick Smith and them at the National Weather Service Norman Forecast Office, you know, get great help from emergency management personnel throughout the state, that visual. One of the things that I thought of as visual with the winter is when we have that heavy snow or ice or something, when I leave the house, I'm expecting I'm going to deal with that. But one of the things that even to this day really scares me is what my mother used to call black ice. And it looks like the pavement's just wet until I'm on top of it, and then it's Bryan Painter on ice, you know, which is not a pretty sight. But so tell me kind of, you know, with dealing with something like that, with black ice, something that it's not as visual as the other type of winter weather hazards we might have.
Yeah, black ice is extremely tricky. Exactly what the name signifies. It's tough to know it's there. Of course, our crews are familiar with how to deal with it. Oftentimes, black ice is formed under several layers of snow. So some of the worst things that could happen is it snows and it stops for a while, but temperatures don't drop, and then you have another layer of snow and then another layer of snow. So you can be certain that there is black ice under those layers because it's been protected and covered by snow. So there is, even when temperatures drop, it takes a little longer to get that final layer under. So we try to make sure we encourage people to stay in if they can, because it takes a little bit of time to get to that bottom layer to deal with. And when there's when there's cars on the roadway, we can't, of course, get to the pavement. So it's one of those tricky situations that we're very familiar with. And again, we work closely with the Highway Patrol, and our crews are out. We try to get to them. They just take a little bit longer because they don't melt easily.
All right. Thanks very much. Gary, Gary hails from Buffalo, Oklahoma, up in the northwest part of the state, and one of the things that you and I talk about a lot, when you were a child, you guys got the snow, 36 inches of snow, and we've had other, really significant snows. I know there was, I think Matt Leyenbauer may be watching this today, and out his way, they had 26 inches, Woodward and Freedom, in March of 2009, and then 27 inches at Spavinaw in 24 hours in 2011. Those snows get a lot of attention, but something that you've also talked to me a lot about are the ice storms. It seems like we've had several of those even since 2000. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and let me just remind you that 27-inch snow in Spavinaw occurred during the beginning of one of our worst droughts on record. So it's really the extreme events that we really remember and can really impact the state. And we have had a series of very severe winter storms dating back to about 2000. We've had around 9 or 10 significant ice storms that did significant damage across the state. Now, normally, going back in history, we'd have one of those about every decade or so. And here we've had, over $1 billion worth of damage in the last decade. More than 1 million people left without power through all those ice storms. So, it really is the extreme event. And when we have those significant type of snow events, it's really, again, it's what's this atmosphere giving us as far as the temperature profile to produce those different types of storms. If you just get that right profile, you're going to get that big blizzard like you got up in Spavinaw, or you got in Woodward and Freedom up in March of 2009. And if you have warmer temperatures, you might get those extreme ice events like we saw 9 or 10 times, like the one that struck Tulsa and Oklahoma City a few years ago, right down the I-44 corridor. So when we talk about what's going to happen during the winter, it really doesn't matter if we're going to predict a wet winter, a dry winter, a warm winter, a cold winter, because those extreme events are singular events, and they can occur during any type of climate regime, any type of weather regime. So when somebody asks me what type of winter are we going to expect this year, I always say, it's Oklahoma. You should really prepare for just about anything. And then if you prepare for the worst, you're always going to be, fully prepared for whatever happens. And that's the same for any type of severe weather season in Oklahoma.
Very good. Terry, I'll play off that word he used right there, prepare. It seems like, and I could be wrong, but it seems like since the Christmas Eve blizzard, a couple of years ago, it seems like maybe people have been a little bit better at staying off, the roads when we anticipated bad winter weather. We had those 2 storms that were about a week apart or something like that, and there are reasons that people do have to get out. But what would you say, what is kind of your viewpoint on that, and what would you say about, really heeding that caution that if you can at all possibly stay home, stay home?
You're absolutely right. 10 years ago, we weren't as strong about saying stay home if you can. but the public weren't partnering with us as much as we see today also. We started to see the trend of staying home if you can a few years even before the 2009 ice storms. However, that really did cause people to know exactly why we say that. We even began to have a few press conferences ahead of time of a storm like that based on information from Gary's shop, for example, or National Weather Service. And it has really been helpful. And I think the fact that there's more ways to get to people and the media, you guys have helped, it really does help get the information out. People are starting to really rely on those reports to plan their trips. And if they can stay home at all, that's certainly what we recommend, because if there's cars on the highway, there's not a way for us to get to clearing the roadways. So that's another challenge we deal with. And some of the worst things that can happen, and we have seen quite a few in recent years, is for snow to begin to fall right before rush hour, whether it's in the morning or whether it's in the evening, because people are trying to get home, and at the same time we're trying to get our equipment out, and it's really, really challenging and difficult. And as you heard Gary, we have some of the most diverse weather in Oklahoma, so being prepared for all different types is what we try to do, and stay in real close contact with those forecasts. In recent years, we also have started using, in the last 2-3 years, we've also started using what we call road weather information sites. We have about 5 right now on I-40 and I-35 different locations. What these sensors do, they not only measure the temperatures beneath the surface, but they also measure the surface temperatures, because those two can be very different. At times, what the temperatures are outside, if it's 32, for example, or 35 degrees outside, it could be in the 20s on the beneath the surface temperatures. So we try to kind of have a good feel for what the temperatures are, to know what type of road clearance mechanism to use. So that's another thing we've used in recent years, and it's really been helpful, and we hope to start seeing more of those sensors around the state. But again, it's another tool in us making the right decision.
All right, thank you. If you're just joining us, I'm Bryan Painter. We're on News OK Live. This is a Google Plus Hangout, and we're talking about winter weather with Terri Angier, his State Transportation Department, and Gary McManus of the Oklahoma Climatological Survey. Gary, you know, one of the challenges Terri and their crews face comes from visibility. I know we've talked before about, and she's even put me in contact with some of their drivers before. They'll be out there on roads that they're extremely familiar with, but all of a sudden they can't tell where the road ends and the ditch begins. And that just seems like, you know, one aspect of winter in Oklahoma. Not only might you get the heavy snows, but you could get 50, 60 mile an hour winds with those. And you know, kind of talk about that, those variables that come together with the wind and the weather.
Yeah, and you know, growing up, especially out in northwestern Oklahoma, when we talk about 50, 60 mile per hour winds, we just call that a Tuesday. You know, that's pretty much the way it works out there, and really across much of Oklahoma. That's again part of our geography. We have the Rockies to our west, and we have the extreme pressure differences that develop because of air flowing over the Rockies, and so we're in a sort of a semi-permanent state of low pressure out there, and we do get a lot of wind with those storm systems that come across. And you know, it's not just what we've seen the last couple of years with blizzards, which of course when you get, you know, snow falling at several inches an hour, and then you add the 50, 60 mile per hour winds, you just get disastrous results. But remember, it wasn't but 5 or 6 years ago that we had one of our worst wildfire seasons on record during the winter of 2005, 2006. Again, fueled by those day-to-day weather conditions, especially the strong winds that we were seeing constantly. So winds play an important part in winter weather, but it's not just the things you think about, like the snow or the ice. And of course, once you get the winds up that high, it takes very little ice freezing on power lines to start downing those power lines. It's sort of when we talk about the damage to the power infrastructure, it's a dance between how much ice has fallen and how much wind there is. So the more wind you have, the less ice you need to really cause catastrophic results in the power infrastructure. And we've seen that in all those ice storms we've had. Different ice thicknesses produce different, pretty much the same amount of damage just because of the wind. So, and winds are very hard. We can say we're going to have a wet, keep saying this over and over, we can predict a wet or a dry winter or cold or warm winter, but it's very hard to predict a windy winter or a calm winter. And also, when we come to talking about drought, wind plays an important part, because when you up the wind speeds, you increase that evaporation from the soils and from reservoirs, and it can still occur even during the winter, where we lose some of that moisture that's so much needed to stay in the soil. So, winds are one of the things that we're going to know maybe a week in advance, and so that's why it's so difficult to predict winter weather.
Gary, for some of our viewers that are just kind of joining us, we'll go back on something for just a minute. They're asking about, if you can kind of talk again about, weather patterns that are out there, ocean temperatures, jet streams, things like that may be an indication toward this winter. Any information, you may have in that regard?
Well, when we talk about these large-scale climate factors, they're important for things like talking about, are we going to see a little bit of drought relief? So if that El Nino that we thought was developing had gone ahead and developed, we might be able to say with a little bit more confidence that we might see some drought relief, because El Nino brings a little bit cooler and wetter conditions to this part of the country. But some of the factors that we think about really aren't that predictable up through a couple of weeks in advance. So something that's really become new in the climate jargon, which is the Arctic oscillation, which is a measure of the pressure differences between surface pressure in the Arctic and parts of the mid-latitudes. A lot of research is going on now to show that changes in that oscillation, or those factors, can really determine if the United States has a warm winter or a cold winter, and that's really played out the last 2 or 3 winters. But I keep harping on this, but even if we could say, we might see some drought relief because of El Nino, or we think this drought might intensify because of La Nina, which has sort of the opposite impact, a warm and drier, cool season here in Oklahoma. It really doesn't allow us to predict, are we going to have a couple of blizzards? Are we going to have a couple of ice storms? So that's why I say, prepare for the worst. It's better to be prepared for the worst severe season possible, even if that's winter, if that's springtime. To recap, we can really sort of try and say, we might have warmer than average or cooler than average or wetter and drier than average, but those singular extreme events, the ones that really impact our lives and cause us danger, those are impossible to predict this far out. So that's more of a weather prediction than a climate prediction.
All right. Thanks, Terry. If you will, one thing I think about when I think about winter weather, I think about snow routes and all, and that's more probably on a city level. But if you would talk about that, talk about how close you work with local communities. You're statewide, but you talked about that teamwork with the National Weather Service, with Gary, with Oklahoma Highway Patrol. Could you kind of give me an idea of how closely you work with local communities?
Sure. We work extremely closely with all the cities and counties, because there's also county crews in terms of where the roads might transition, or just in terms of how we work together and get the information out to the public. Because to the average person, when they're driving, going from home to work, they are going to hit every road possibly without knowing. They may hit a city road, a county road, and a local and a state road, and not know the difference. Neither should they worry about that. So we try to work very closely with them, and that's why the city puts out the snow routes, and we try to get to all the highways as much as possible. We don't clear roads on the city roads or county, and neither do they. They all have enough on their hands to worry about our roads and vice versa. But there is always such a thing as helping each other out if there is a major situation. Several years ago, you may remember, there was a really bad ice storm in southeast Oklahoma that none of us were experiencing here. So not only were our crews busy down there, we dispatched crews from the other parts of the state to go help the counties and the cities and our own highways in the southeast portion, because not much was going on for a change, Gary, in northwest Oklahoma at the time, but all the attention was on southeast Oklahoma. So we do things like that. Same with counties. Sometimes they come to our assistance in an area where we may need a little more push on a highway to get that clear, so they don't have to worry about possibly a county road that won't be as helpful. So there is a lot of cooperation, but to begin with, we really each have our own areas, and we keeping very good communication to see where the needs may be.
All right, thanks. Gary, I'm going to cheat off my notes here because there's a point that I wanted to cover with you. In 1969, 16 inches of snow fell in Pauls Valley. In 1959, Edmond had a snow with drifts 8 feet deep. In 99, up at Pond Creek, 20 inches. Earlier I mentioned the 26 inches, in the northwest. The one thing all these have in common is they were in March. They weren't in December, January, February. These ones I'm talking about are March. Kind of tell me what sets up for some of these significant snowfalls, as we're moving towards spring.
Yeah, when we start to get into early spring, of course the sun starts getting higher in the air. We start getting warmer. And that gives a little bit more fuel to all these storm systems, a little bit more moisture to work with, a little bit more chance for convective precipitation, which is when you really see those big time snows. It's generally associated with convection. So when we get into March, and the 26 inches that fell in 2009 in Buffalo or Freedom and Woodward, that was, I believe, like March 27th or March 29th. So it was right at the end of March. It was almost April. It gets warmer. The Gulf, you start getting more evaporation off the Gulf of Mexico, which provides more moisture. The air's a little bit warmer in advance of these storms. So it's really just a time of the year when you can start to get more of those ingredients come together for more juice, if you want to put it that way, to get some convective type systems. And, it's the same thing when we see March tornadoes. That's the reason, that we start to see those types of things, is because, it's getting warmer and there's a little bit more fuel and a little bit more heat to work with.
Gary, when we talk about winter and we talk about viewers asking about climate information and, will it be cold or warm? Will it be wet or dry? One of the things that you talk about, if you look historically, I guess that's one of the things you go off of. Historically, those winter months fall where, as far as, in terms of among the wettest or among the driest, and how to use that coming into this winter? I mean, is there any indication that those are giving you now?
Well, yeah, and it's for the exact same reason we talked about March. It's, December, January, and February are the 3 driest months of the year in Oklahoma. There's just really not a lot of moisture to work with. There's not a lot of fuel to work with. It's cold. The sun's low in the sky. The Gulf is kind of shut off. And so that's what I was talking about earlier with the drought that we're in now. We're entering the driest part of the year with some of our worst drought conditions we've seen over the last couple of years. Now, if we'll be fortunate if it works out like last year. As we got into October, we had an even worse drought in place last October. We saw some fantastic rainfall that was against all odds, really, because we had a La Nina system in place, or a La Nina event in place in the equatorial Pacific, which is supposed to make us warmer and drier. But just talking expecting a normal type winter precipitation pattern. That's why, I say when we come into the spring next year, we'll probably still be in some sort of drought situation because those winter months are so much drier. Now, there are different stresses, though, that go along with winter versus summer. Even though summer is wetter than the winter, there's also a lot more heat, and the plants are growing full blast, so they're using all the water they can. Humans are using water at a greatly increased pace to water their lawns, fill up swimming pools. So there is still a sort of a trade-off between the two seasons. It might be drier in the winter, but at least that water is not under as much demand. So that's why I say winter is always kind of a recharge period. And what we've seen the last couple of years as we've gotten into the summers is a sort of a memory in our soils from what's happened in the winter. We've had two different types of drought situations over the last couple of summers. Both ended up being extremely hot, of course, because of that drought. But if you can at least get some momentum through the winter and keep those rains going through the spring, maybe you can prevent some of that drastic summer drought and drastic summer heat that develops.
All right, thanks. Terri, any final comments on some things that we should keep in mind going into this winter?
First of all, I want to cover the second part of your question I never answered, as far as the resources we have available to us and the kind of number of trucks and that sort of thing. We have crews in all the 77 counties in the state. We also have additional crews that deal specifically with interstate. So it's over about 115 crews on a statewide level. If everybody was out and working, that's how many we would have. We have over 550 trucks specifically designed to handle road clearance for snow and ice, and over 1,100 crew members. Of course, safety is our number one priority, so we definitely will have to hire more if we need more, depending on the conditions. We are in extremely good shape with our materials this year, every year, but this year particularly because we just finished building a huge shed near the port of Catoosa that we've used the last few years that can hold double the amounts we'll need for a normal winter, if there is such a thing as a normal winter. But they're all fully stocked. We have 70,000 tons of salt and sand mix already, and another reserve of 70,000 in sand alone, and another reserve of 32,000 in salt, which is in great shape. And that's really because of the vision of some of our leaders that really sought to build the shed and start to store some over there. All that said, and how prepared we are, we could not do this without the cooperation of the public and them staying safe while they're out. So the number one rule is if they can stay home, we ask them to do that. They have been great in really taking our urges and asking them to stay home. If they can, they do. We've noticed, and we're not too quick to jump out and say stay home when it's not as bad. So we want to be credible. So when we say stay home, we really mean if you can stay home. And they've been great partners with us. But AAA has a great site with a number of different things we could be looking at to prepare in our vehicles, such as additional extra batteries, like you'd mentioned, Bryan, in terms of cell phones. Some people use a kitty litter to have for traction, or sand or salt in the back of their cars. It helps weigh the car down, but it also helps in case you get stuck in a small type of hole that you can pull yourself out. Of course, gloves and all those things, and scrapers are a big one that we forget, on water, and possibly some heavy snacks in case God forbid we get stranded. But those are some of the main things that I can think of that would be helpful. But hopefully if they can stay home and not have to rely on any of those things, that would be our ultimate goal.
All right, thanks very much. Gary McManus, Oklahoma Climatological Survey, Terri Angier, State Transportation Department. Thank you both very, very much for joining me today. This has been a Google Plus Winter Weather Hangout, and I really appreciate you watching this today, and may you have a safe winter.